Oh, sorry. And of course, in the variance in the share of the licensed workforce, this is the variance that I would focus on in this work. This is the restrictiveness indicator by the EU. This is the new one by the OECD, which I took part in making. And here is a map of the US. Again, a similar country, similar occupations, but big variance in the licensing between states. So this is the variance of OL between OECD states. I've used several resources. It's only OECD countries. I know there's several substantial shortcomings for this data, that it's gathered from different researches from different years, but this is what we have so far, and this is what we can use unless the OECD decides to survey the share of licensed workers in one consolidated research. So this is what we have: a big variance from Germany with more than 30% of the workforce licensed to Denmark with less than 15. So my research aims are as follows. I aim to explain what explains the variance in occupational licensing between states. Even though occupational licensing is a significant and broad phenomenon, it's mainly understood in the literature and explained in the level of the occupation. We know why an occupation, or we think we know why an occupation is licensed, but we don't know why it would be more likely to be licensed in one country than in another. So the broad political economy context of occupational licensing is left underexplored in the literature. I want to understand occupational licensing as an institution, and I aim to understand it as part of the institutional settings of an economy. Again, not to test it in the level of the occupation, but in the level of the economy. What is the right context to understand occupational licensing? So I'm going to do this very short and very brief, owing to the time restrictions. So I'm going to examine the correlations of occupational licensing with three major features in countries' political economy. One is labor organization, as occupational licensing is an instrument of labor protection, again, different than traditional labor organization, but still a mechanism of labor protection. The other one is government size, as occupational licensing is an instrument of government control. And vocational education, as occupational licensing is an instrument for setting professional standards. So of course, these institutions are not standalone, they interact and intertwine, but still when I examine it separately. And just not really an hypothesis, but our intuition, I think, would be that the more its economy is restricted, the higher would be the share of occupational licensing. And because occupational licensing is another method to restrict the market. I'm going to run simple correlation analysis between occupational licensing and the indicators of these institutions. Two indicators for each institution. It's a macro level analysis. The N is too small for running a regression and to do a more elaborate analysis, at least in this stage. So the results that I have from running regressions are not significant, hence I'm doing only correlations. I don't suggest here an indication for causation yet, only for correlation. And the data sources that I used is the data from the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, and the OECD. And again, bear in mind that it's only a preliminary research. So let's delve into it. The first correlation I run is occupational licensing and union density. And we see here that there is a quite substantial negative correlation. The higher occupational licensing, the lower is the union density. And to reinforce this, to robust this correlation, I've ran Cook's distance robustness check. You can see that the negative correlation still stands quite vividly. I've done this this robustness check for all the correlation analysis that you will soon see, but I've only showed this one because just to show you an example. Another indication of labor organization that I've examined its correlation with occupational licensing is collective bargaining agreement. And you can see here again, negative correlation, quite substantial negative correlation if we take all the OECD states. And I suggest several explanations for this negative correlation between occupational licensing and union density and collective bargaining agreement. Of course, union density and collective bargaining agreement to a certain extent overlap. So OL and traditional labor organization are substitutive as they fulfill similar aims of labor protection. So workers, in some of the cases, need to choose only one mechanism of labor protection. They would, of course, would want to have them both, but they are usually going to resources that are limited to only one, so they need to choose this one or the other. And the distribution of the mechanism, they're opt whether to take to be a member of a union or to be a part of a collective bargaining agreement or to be covered by occupational licensing is a matter of centralization. Centralization in the country's political economy is linked with unionization, and this so means that occupational licensing is linked with decentralization. I thought in the beginning that it's only a matter of industry composition, but according to a preliminary study examination that I ran, it's not correlated, and even there's no indication that this is the reason for this distribution, for this negative correlation. The second institution, the second feature, of the political economy that I study is the occupational licensing and government size. So the first one is occupational licensing and government spending. Again, we see a negative correlation. A negative correlation between occupational licensing and government spending. This is the government spending as a share of the GDP in 2013. And similar is the occupational licensing and government employment. Again, negative correlation, which means that the bigger is the government, the less occupational licensing, the less the market is covered by occupational licensing. So there's a couple of suggested explanation for this negative correlation, that OL as a regulation substitute more traditional mechanisms of government control. Just to give you an example, if the government provide services of physical therapy provided directly, then the government doesn't need to regulate it. It already controls it by employing physical therapists. This is one example, which happens to be true in Israel. And these negative correlation resonate the theory of the regulatory state, or regulatory capitalism. According to privatization is correlated with regulation. So the more the market is privatized, the more is it regulated. It's a theory that was developed, among others, by David Levifo, which is also my supervisor in my PhD. And the distribution of the mechanism of whether regulation as occupational licensing or government employment and government spending is also associated with centralization. Centralization is linked with big government, and hence occupational licensing is linked with decentralization. And of course, as you know, there is correlation between government size and labor organization. Government employees are usually unionized or usually covered by collective bargaining agreements, at least in the OECD. And the last institution I study occupational licensing with is vocational education. And contradictory to the other institution, here we see a positive correlation between occupational licensing and vocational education attainment. I don't have yet all the countries in this correlation, but I'm still working on it. And by another indicator of vocational education prevalence, we again see a positive correlation, substantial positive correlation. And a suggestion for this a suggestion for explanation for this correlation is that occupational licensing and vocational education complement and reinforce each other. Occupational licensing promotes vocational training. Sometimes it's even obligate vocational training, while vocational training promotes professionalization, and by that, professionalization, as we know, usually advances regulation of the occupation, usually it's licensing. Of course, this is relevant only for a few occupations. Vocational training is rather, today in the modern world, is rather a minor phenomenon, only several percentages in each country. Of the labor force in each country undergo vocational training. And another reason that we can understand this, we can explain this positive correlation is that occupational licensing and vocational education reflect both a similar approach towards professions in the country. Both require formal recognition and state involvement in the qualification of professionals, and hence this positive correlation makes a lot of sense. So conclusions and implications for this preliminary study. So first of all, we see that occupational licensing can be and should be understood in the economy level, and not only in the level of the occupation, not only in the economy without the other countries. Differences in occupational licensing between countries correlates with differences in other aspects in the political economy, in the labor market. OL is not a standalone phenomenon. It interacts with other institutions. It influences by other features in the labor market. And I think counterintuitively, OL correlates positively with market restrictiveness and centralization. Correlates negatively with market restrictiveness and centralization, meaning in economies that are centralized and very restricted, as Scandinavian countries, we see actually a low degree of occupational licensing, and in more liberal economies, we see actually a higher level of occupational licensing. But nevertheless, intuitively, occupational licensing correlates with vocational education. And the distribution and correlation of mechanisms in each country has significant implications on the market. So I've touched thus far only on the explanations, not only on the institutional settings, but it has some significant implications on the market. The correlations indicate on the role of the government. It indicates which workers obtain protection in a country that has a higher level of occupational licensing and lower level of traditional labor organization. More likely, it means that workers that are more knowledgeable, that are more skilled, obtain higher protection than workers that don't have these skills. It also can imply about the solidarity and affiliation between workers. For example, in a country that there is high level of occupational licensing, we would see an increased solidarity between practitioners of the same occupations, while in a country with a higher level of unionization, we would see solidarity between workers in the same union, not necessarily in the same occupation. And last but not least, this is only a preliminary research. I suggest here some basis, some foundations for further research. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yair. As Alicia mentioned, unfortunately, Jason Hicks, because of the situation in Minneapolis, won't be